Hello.
Yes, ma'am. Good afternoon, madam.
Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am. Good afternoon, madam.
Good afternoon.
Ma'am, can you pull down your laptop, ma'am, camera? Little bit. Yes, ma'am. Good, ma'am. Perfect, ma'am.
Can you see the screen?
Yes, ma'am. We can. Yes, we are.
Good evening, ma'am.
Good evening. So let me know when you would like to start.
Sure, sir. Sure, ma'am. Sure, ma'am. I will let you know, ma'am. Ma'am, we will start at 4:05, ma'am.
Yeah, sure, no problem.
Okay, ma'am. Can we start, ma'am?
Okay. Okay, welcome everyone to the last session of the basic infertility course which we are doing. Please let me know if I'm not audible or clear, or if you have any doubts, please feel free to raise them at the end of the session. I just wanted to let you know the other day when I did the stimulation protocols for IUI and IVF, there has been request to discuss about ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome. I thought it was incorporated into this session, but that will be spoken as a different session. And if anyone else is interested, please feel free to comment on the chat box or get in touch with the BDM, and we'll organize a session on hyperstimulation syndrome as well. So advanced technologies in assisted reproduction is quite interesting because we are always left with the question of what to answer our patient if we do not succeed even after doing an IVF, or if after having a lot of ovulation inductions or IUIs, and each time the patient comes, they want to know the reason why it's not happening. And even as clinicians, we also would like to do a lot for them. What else can I do for them in order for them to succeed? So we'll go through what are the advances, and still there is hope for a lot of patients. Once we come to the end, we know that things are advancing very fast, and hopefully we can apply to many of our patients in the coming years, and also currently we are doing them. So what is the aim of our talk is improving the process and technology, which eventually should result in increasing in implantation rate. What it means by implantation rate is each embryo we are transferring should have the potential to result in a pregnancy, not just a pregnancy, but a live birth. So we want to transfer minimum number of embryos and increase the number of live births, that is the take-home baby rate. So eventually it's not just about the becoming pregnant, but having a healthy baby. So what are the various aspects that we can look into? So first, it's the embryo and the endometrium. But however, for us to get a good quality embryo, we need good quality sperm and an oocyte. So from the sperm perspective, there is something called magnetic activated cell sorting. From the oocyte perspective, we have made advancement in oocyte vitrification. From the embryo perspective, there's been a lot of advancements in terms of how we are looking at the morphology of the embryo, and mainly moving to only and only day 5 transfer, which is a blastocyst transfer, and also using time-lapse technology in terms of selecting the best quality embryos. And as I said, using only blastocyst transfer, and lately and recently artificial intelligence and machine learning in terms of selecting the embryos is likely to make a huge difference in terms of how we are going to select the embryos to give a live birth, and not just a live birth but a chromosomally normal embryo, so that genetic abnormalities can be minimized. And not just that, but we also have the invasive method in terms of pre-implantation genetic screening. And coming to the endometrial aspect of it, there is a lot that has been done, and for quite a few years we were left with no answer regarding recurrent implantation failure as well as recurrent miscarriages. So there's two aspects that they've looked into: endometrial receptivity array, which is a ERA, and more recently endometrial microbiome, which is making a lot of advancement in terms of helping us to give hope to the couple with recurrent miscarriages and implantation failures. So magnetic activated cell sorting is where we'll start from. It's about selecting the best sperm when we are using sperm for ICSI. So it is a semen preparation technique. This enables the immune magnetic separation of healthy spermatozoa which have the potential of fertilization from less healthy one, which are the apoptotic spermatozoa, which has less possibility of survival. So this is an extremely important step when we are doing ICSI, selecting the best sperm, because only if the sperm quality and oocyte quality is good, then only we will be able to result in a good quality embryo and a live birth directly. What is the apoptosis? Apoptosis, also known as programmed cell death, is a regulation process of the cell cycle. It may occur during the spermatogenesis if the cell damages such as DNA fragmentation appear within the sperm. So there are several case studies on infertile patients that show that in the ejaculated sample there are high level of apoptotic spermatozoa. This means the autoregulation process has failed, which is resulting in high level of damaged cells. And there's various causes to it like smoking, stress, fever, or other conditions like varicocele. So when is this technique indicated? It could be when the sperm quality is poor, when the motility and morphology are low, though the count is reasonably all right, or if there is high DNA fragmentation or high degree of HOS negative sample. And we also find high level of apoptotic spermatozoa in someone who smokes or has got varicocele or who is unwell, or in patients with more than 2 cycles with unexpected poor fertilization, and also in couple who are experiencing recurrent miscarriages. So there are some data that we can go through. So MAX has been used in 309 patients in a study, and the average number of cycles they've had is 1.38. Female average age is 32, male is 34. Fresh embryo transfers were done in 180 patients. Pregnancy in fresh ET was 48.89%, and after frozen transfer, the pregnancy rate was 54%. So if we compare how many oocytes we got before MAX and after MAX in the same patients, so pre-MAX self oocytes were looked into in 47 oocytes and post-MAX 44 oocytes. So 44 patients, the oocytes were this is self oocytes pre-MAX in 47 patients and post-MAX of 44 patients. The pregnancy rate was 23% without MAX and 34% post-MAX. Ongoing pregnancy rate of 6.38% without MAX and 31.8% post-MAX. This is very highly statistically significant difference. So it gives us a lot of hope in terms of who have been experiencing problems with poor fertilization or who's a chronic smoker who can't get back to quitting smoking and they don't have time, or repeated miscarriages. So this is a significantly high difference. And when we come to donor oocytes, it's giving a pregnancy rate of 20% pre-MAX, whereas post-MAX you can see it's even more significant with 66.7%, and ongoing pregnancy rate of 6% in pre-MAX, whereas it's 50% post-MAX. So MAX is extremely helpful in selecting the healthy spermatozoa to be used for ICSI and ultimately resulting in a pregnancy as well as ongoing pregnancy. So let's move on to oocytes. So in terms of improving oocyte quality, there is no test that can predict the oocyte quality. However, there's a lot of factors which affect the quality of the oocytes. Like we know, advanced maternal age is something which we can't reverse, and that significantly affects the oocyte quality. But we also know that high BMI can affect oocyte quality. And we also know women with PCOS or endometriosis can also have altered oocyte quality. But there is no blood test as such that we can do, or there is no test like MAX that we can use to get better eggs or oocytes to be used in ICSI. So what else we can do in these patients is cryopreservation of good quality oocytes. So it is a process of cooling cooling and storing cells, tissues, or organs at a very low temperature to maintain their viability. So there are two techniques, slow freezing and vitrification. Slow freezing was used probably a decade ago, or it's been slowly stopped in Western countries. I'm not sure in India whether they're still using slow freezing, but in Nova we are only using vitrification method. So what is the basic difference between the both? So the temperature to which they need to be stored at is done gradually in slow freezing, and it's done very rapidly in vitrification using a vitrification solution. So the rate at which cooling is done is 2 lakh degrees centigrade per minute. So the cooling is done within a few seconds to the required temperature, what we want. Whereas in slow freezing, we do it 0.3 degrees centigrade per minute. So what will happen if you're doing slow cooling? There is ice crystal formation when we are doing slow freezing and within the oocyte, and that can cause damage to the oocyte. And there is no ice crystal formation in vitrification that will maintain the chromosomal status of the oocytes and results in less damage, which is in terms of meiotic spindle disturbances very less likely to happen with vitrification. So there are some data from Nova itself. So if you see, there's a lot of cycles done regarding vitrification. If you see the pregnancy rate and the implantation rate after using vitrified oocytes, it's total of 1741 cycles were done, which resulted in 51% pregnancy rate and 35% implantation rate. And we've done 1464 frozen embryo transfers, and it results in 54% pregnancy rate and 39.7% implantation rate. So these are very promising, and it will help couple who are not ready to have a pregnancy, but they're running out of time. And there's a lot of couple who might want to vitrify their oocytes for various reasons. So oocyte vitrification, we are having excellent oocyte survival rate after vitrification. And in terms of comparing with the embryo vitrification, we are having very good fertilization rate of the vitrified and thawed oocyte, which has been used for fertilization. The FERT rate is good, embryo development is good, and ongoing pregnancy rate after ICSI are also comparable to that of fresh oocytes. Pregnancy rate is also as high as 80% after oocyte vitrification, and oocyte vitrification also reduces the risk of OHSS. At the same time, it significantly resulted in higher pregnancy rate compared with coasting in patients at risk of OHSS. So sometimes if the partner is not around, like I have a couple now, husband is stuck elsewhere and he's not able to fly back, but they are running out of time. So they can also vitrify oocytes so that the quality is maintained rather than running out of time. And when the husband comes, we can move on with ICSI and transferring the embryos. So it's a new way of our work. We can also have egg banking for ovum donation. So we can vitrify oocytes instead of embryos when someone is in need of oocytes, like patients with poor ovarian reserve or premature ovarian failure. We can also use these oocytes for research purposes in implantation genetic screening. We can also defer the embryo transfer at a convenient time to the patient and the unit. Most relevantly, when the patient has come across any medical problems for which she is unable to have, she need not be worried, as they are giving very good and very high pregnancy rate. And coming to fertility preservation, for women with advanced stage or low reserve, it's extremely useful. Not just them, but also women who's been diagnosed of cancer and they're advised to have chemotherapy. We can do a random start IVF and do the egg collection and vitrify the oocytes and save it for later use. And they can be very hopeful of getting good pregnancy rates with vitrified oocytes. And not just that, we also have low responder patients in which we may not get one or more than 2 or 3 oocytes per stimulation, in which case we can vitrify all the oocytes and do ICSI for all the oocytes at once so that they can have a chance of blastocyst transfer. As I was speaking during the stimulation protocol in low responder patients, if the age is about 35, they'll need at least 10 to 12 oocytes to get one euploid blastocyst. Or in someone less than 35 as well with poor reserve, they do need to have a lot of oocytes to get one euploid blastocyst. So in terms of that, we can collect the oocytes, vitrify them, and when we have enough number of oocytes, they can do the ICSI and try to be hopeful of getting an blastocyst, which can result in a pregnancy. So number of embryo transfers in our experience through oocyte vitrification 69, and pregnancies resulted were 40, giving a pregnancy rate of 57.97% and implantation rate of 37.40%. So that's about sperm and oocyte. Now let's move on to endometrium. So endometrium has been like a black box, but recently we are having a lot of advancements. ERA has been out for quite few years now, at least 3 to 5 years, but it's been extensively used in a lot of units for the past couple of years, and we have our own experiences which is giving fantastic results. So it's a customized array to diagnose the receptivity status of the endometrium in the window of implantation. So we all know that there is a window of implantation when the embryo can stick to the endometrium. However, that varies from person to person, and what that window is for that particular patient is what we need to know. So what it's going to do is study a group of 238 genes to diagnose the receptivity status of the endometrium in the implantation period. So it helps us in modifying the luteal support to improve the success rate. So how is this done? First, we need to take a biopsy. When do we take a biopsy? In a natural cycle, endometrial biopsy should be taken 7 days after LH surge. So we need to test for LH surge either by blood test or LH kits are also available, and then do a biopsy 7 days later. In a HRT, that is hormone replacement cycle, we need to prepare the endometrium by giving estradiol valerate 6 to 8 milligram per day. Once the endometrial thickness is at least 7 millimeters and a triple layer pattern, or even if you don't have a triple layer pattern, it at least needs to be 7 millimeters, from which we start progesterone, pessaries, and do a biopsy 5 days later. So what are the results? So the biopsy tells us whether the endometrium is ready to take the embryo when we have taken the biopsy, that is receptive, or it's over receptive, that is post receptive, that is it's past the stage of receptivity, or it's not yet ready to take the blastocyst, so that is pre-receptive. So what can we do? So receptive means gene expression profile corresponds with a normal receptive endometrium. So it is recommended to do the embryo transfer in the window of implantation, that is exactly when we do the biopsy. And if it's not receptive, then the gene expression profile does not correspond with the normal endometrium. So then we need to individualize the embryo transfer. How we can do that? So how we can manage non-receptive endometrium? So what happens is, if we are getting as a pre-receptive endometrium, we get a report saying that after how many hours it's likely to be receptive. So in which case, we have to give those many extra hours of progesterone before we transfer. Say for example, it's pre-receptive by 24 hours, then we do embryo blastocyst transfer 24 hours later. So coming to the clinical outcome, total of 174 patients had, and in 150 it was receptive, and in 24 patients it was non-receptive. That is, in majority of them it's receptive. So if total number of patients with receptive era are 150, number of previous embryo transfers 3.73, total number of patients with personalized embryo transfer of receptive era are 126, and the pregnancy rate was 51% after personalized embryo transfer, and the implantation rate was 36%. As you can see, the number of embryo transfers done previously were nearly 4. So these patients must have gone through a lot of trauma, whether they're really going to have a pregnancy or not. And out of them, nearly 50% of them will have a pregnancy after personalized embryo transfer. If we come down to cumulative pregnancy rate per patient, it's nearly 62%. So in majority of those couple, we will be able to achieve a pregnancy by using personalized embryo transfer. So the same in non-receptive patients, cumulative pregnancy rate is 75%. So if we get a report as a non-receptive one, we're going to do it when it's going to be receptive. So recently they've changed the pattern. They just don't give whether it's receptive or non-receptive, but they specifically mention whether it's receptive, pre-receptive, or post-receptive. In addition to that, they also mention how many hours after the current biopsy is it likely to be receptive in case it's pre-receptive. In case the report comes as post-receptive, how many hours before is it the endometrium likely to be in the receptive status is what they're going to mention. So in my experience of all the patients I have done in Nova in Vijayawada, in majority of the patients I am getting as pre-receptive, and only in a very minority of the patients I'm getting it as receptive. So it also is important who we select to have this test done, because when we are getting more patients as pre-receptive, these are the group of patients probably who are more likely to benefit. If it comes back as receptive, also it may be helpful that we look into other factors which might be causing negative pregnancy. But if it's pre-receptive, so far the patients I have done, nearly 20 patients, we had pre-receptive, and majority of them achieved pregnancy. Only one patient didn't. However, she had very poor quality oocytes and advanced maternal age, and she already had 5 IVF cycles outside elsewhere, and still she was very adamant to use her own embryos. So if we have reasonable quality embryos, and if we have ERA as pre-receptive and we transfer, the pregnancy rate, I would say, in my experience, is more than 90%. So now we have just seen whether it's receptive, non-receptive, or pre-receptive, whatever. So is that the only thing that we need to know about the endometrium? As we can see, still 25% of the patients are not getting pregnant, even though the endometrium shows as non-receptive. And even in my experience, still 1 or 2 patients didn't achieve pregnancy. So what else could be going on? Is there anything other advanced treatments? So lately, they've been looking at asynchronous and pathological windows of implantation. These are the 2 causes of recurrent implantation failure. So it's not just about where the window of implantation is. We also need to find out whether there is any pathology in the window of implantation. So that might help us to furthermore increase the chances if we get a better understanding of the pathology. So far, studies have been ongoing, but we do not have any result yet. And they're also using artificial intelligence technology and endometrial gene expression for distinguishing both between displaced window of implantation and pathological window of implantation to get an answer for patients with recurrent implantation failure or even recurrent miscarriage. So this will be groundbreaking because it will help us answer the questions of a lot of couples, and also help us to give higher success rate and more satisfaction. So those are the two aspects of pathological implantation, window of implantation and displaced window of implantation. Not just that, but there's also some other advances in terms of endometrial microbiome status. And there is a test which can be done called EMA to look at the endometrial microbiome. However, initial studies are very encouraging, but we need more data before we can apply it to our patients on a routine practice. So this is a study utilizing next generation sequencing, examining the endometrial fluid as well as vaginal aspirate in 35 women prior to IVF, and found that the presence of non-lactobacillus dominated microbiodata in the endometrium was associated with decrease in implantation rate, ongoing pregnancy rate, as well as live birth rate. So if we see there is a difference, it's the endometrial microbiodata, not vaginal. So there are different kinds of microbiota between the vaginal and endometrial tissues. So we should not be confused. We have to be very clear what we are looking at. They both are similar, but there are some differences between both vaginal and endometrial microbiota, and in 20% of them they're asymptomatic, though there is an imbalance. So what we are aiming at is there needs to be a stability of the endometrial microbiota during the acquisition of endometrial receptivity. So if there is dysbiosis of this balance, it can lead to poor reproductive outcomes. So they can be classified as lactobacillus dominated and non-lactobacillus dominated. So when there is more than 90% lactobacillus, it's dominated, and if it's less than 90% of lactobacillus, it's non-lactobacillus dominated. So the results are good with lactobacillus dominated compared to non-lactobacillus dominated. So not just in terms of implantation, but also on
ఈరోజు సర్క్యులర్ కూడా పంపించారు సార్, డెత్స్ అవుతున్నాయి ట్రయల్స్ క్లినిక్ ఒకటి పెట్టుకొని.
So let's move on to the next stage, which is the viable embryo. So we've looked at sperm, we've looked at oocyte, we've looked at the endometrium, and now coming to embryo. So what are the technologies for embryo selection? It's the morphological grading, taking them to blastocyst culture, using time-lapse technology, and again using artificial intelligence, as well as pre-implantation genetic screening. Not just that, but also cell-free DNA testing in the media of the blastocyst is also the latest advancement. So these are how the blastocysts look, very impressive. We love to see they come up to this stage. What are the advantages? It's an opportunity to select the most viable embryos for transfer and to allow genetically defective embryos to cease development and allow normal to survive more selected population for replacement. So it's also important that it helps us in the avoidance of inheritance of abnormal paternal genome after ICSI, and potential decrease in the number of embryos transferred and higher implantation rate. So these two last words, decrease in the number of embryos transferred and higher implantation rate, is the key here, because the less number of embryos we transfer that results in a successful pregnancy, the more likely we will be able to achieve a healthy baby. So what are the advantages of there if we get a blastocyst? So it improves the synchrony between the embryonic stage and uterine environment, because immediately after the pickup, day 3, the estradiol levels are likely to be very high. If you move it to day 5, which is a blastocyst stage, it's likely to have improved, and there is reduced uterine contractility with blastocyst transfer and reduced risk of embryo expulsion. If we see the pregnancy rates between day 3 and blastocyst transfers, it's significantly different. 46% with day 3 and 58% with the blastocyst. So that's the blastocyst culture, and I would say that 99% of the cycles need to be done with the blastocyst transfer, except in patients who we are not able to get more than 3 or 4 day 3 good quality embryos. And even in those patients, we can use oocyte vitrification and pooling of oocytes and then perform ICSI and try and achieve a blastocyst culture. So the other technology that we have is a time-lapse technology or embryoscope. So it's a grading of cleavage stage embryo is based on the number and symmetry of the blastomere, degree of fragmentation, and presence and number of nuclei in size. So all these parameters are taken into consideration. There is a high degree of inter and intra-observer variability. So morphology as well as developmental competence is not firmly correlated. So this is very simple. We get beautiful blastocysts on day 5, we transfer, and sometimes it results in a negative pregnancy. So again, we are left with the question of transferred a good quality blastocyst, why we still didn't get a positive pregnancy? Because morphology is not always correlating with the developmental competence. So how this helps? So if you look at this, it takes a photograph. If you're using time-lapse monitoring in the incubators, it takes a photograph of the embryo every 15 minutes, and we get nearly 1500 pictures per embryo during 3 days. So it's a non-invasive method of monitoring how the embryo is growing. It's in a controlled and closed stable culture environment where the embryo is not exposed to the ambient conditions. And we also can grow the embryos without changing media on day 3. It's a single culture media. So basically, the minimal disturbance we cause to the embryo in terms of change in temperature, pH, or outside exposure to gases, the minimum it is, the better they grow. So when we are using a closed system and just observing through our imaging techniques, which we can just transfer it to our laptop and have a look at it, and then decide which embryo is doing well. And we only get the embryo out when we want to transfer them or freeze them. So it monitors 24 hours during the development, and it helps us better morphological evaluation when the cleavage is happening, and is it happening regularly, or are there a lot of changes that they move from 2 cell to 4 cell quickly, but then they take a long time from 4 to 8 cell, or is there an abnormal division? All this we'll be able to know better if there is a continuous monitoring, as well as the morphodynamic assessment as well. And if you're using a machine or we're using a continuous monitoring, there can be less number of intra-observer variations. So if you see, then this is the data where patients had all normal embryos as per time lapse in 209 patients. It resulted in a pregnancy rate of 47.84%, and as per the time lapse, if the embryos are mixed, normal, and borderline, then it's 46.39%. If they're all abnormal embryos, it's 34%, and all multinucleate embryos, it's 35%, and all embryos with direct cleavage, it's only 23%. So we know which embryos are likely to implant better. Still, we are not there. Though we can improve our selection, still there is a lot to do, which kind of embryos are going to result in a successful pregnancy. So this is an advancement on top of blastocyst culture. And coming to the next level, artificial intelligence for embryo selection. So what exactly the work that's been going on recently is they're trying to feed the systems with a lot of data, where through time lapse they have the images of the embryos that have resulted in a pregnancy and live birth. So when a lot of embryos which did not result in a pregnancy also are fed through artificial intelligence to the system, so that the system they develop a process through which the system identifies which kind of embryos are likely to result in pregnancy or live birth and which kind of embryos may not result. So this has been this work has been going on for the past few years, and there's been a lot of countries who are doing this work, but still the data they have been published as well, but we need more data before we completely use artificial intelligence selection of embryos for selecting the embryo for a transfer. So if you see the accuracy for prediction of clinical pregnancy, that is heartbeat, is 65.4% as per a study. What it means is selecting this embryo will result in a heartbeat in 65 patients out of 100. And there is also another process where they give KIT score D5 embryo algorithm. What it is the same as I said before. They feed the system and they develop algorithms where these embryos have resulted in a live birth and which did not result in a pregnancy or a live birth. And depending on that, they give a score for a day 5 embryo, and it's all done by the EmbryoScope scoring system. And they're more likely to select a chromosomally normal embryo, which is more likely to achieve a pregnancy and live birth. So there's different groups from different countries who are working on artificial intelligence use for selecting the embryos, which is giving very positive results and hope. So I think in future that's the way forward to select the embryos. Our embryologists are very good at trying to select the good sperm, trying to do the best technique for ICSI. But regarding the selection, also they do a good job. But when we feed thousands and thousands, this data is they've fed nearly 15 to 20,000 embryos to the system, and then it remembers and recognizes the pattern, and then when it's selecting, it uses all that intelligence to select the embryo which are likely to give a higher pregnancy rate. So there's various things which have been going on. I think that will be the way forward, and it will make the life of embryologist also easy. So he doesn't have to worry too much when he's confused or she's confused about what's the best embryo if they are borderline. So what next? Pre-implantation genetic screening. So we want chromosomally normal, though artificial intelligence also to a certain extent is going to help us with chromosomal status, but still currently we are using pre-implantation genetic screening. It helps us to not transfer aneuploid embryos which are unlikely to result in a pregnancy and avoid a miscarriage. And some patients are at high risk of aneuploidy and they may go for egg donation, and we can replace less number of embryos which are more likely to result in a pregnancy if we do PGS. So what are the indications? Advanced maternal age, recurrent implantation failure, repeated miscarriages, severe male factor infertility, or previous sporadic genetically abnormal pregnancy. And if someone wants a single embryo transfer and increase their success rate, or by patient choice if they're very particular about having a healthy baby. So that can be done on polar body, day 3 and day 5 trophectoderm biopsies. And these are the patterns that result in a normal embryo, monosomic embryo, or chaotic embryo. And the results are, if total number of PGS cycles were done with 263, and with normal embryos, it resulted in a 77.6% cycles with all abnormal embryos, and no ETs were possible in 59 patients. And the incidence of chromosomal abnormalities, if you see, is higher as the age goes up. So the number of abnormal embryos are nearly 60% in less than 35 years old, and 67% in 36 to 37-year-olds, and 72% in 38 to 39-year-old. And if you're over 40, the chances are 84.7%. So we have to be very careful when we are counseling couples. Though their ovarian reserve may be normal after this age, they also need to be emphasized regarding the likelihood of chromosomal abnormalities with advancing age. And the clinical outcome, if we see, number of cycles 149 in less than 35, and fewer cycles in 36 and above age group. Percentage of patients with normal embryos, as you can see, it's going down from 87% to 32%, and mean number of embryos transferred are relatively more or less the same. And if you see the pregnancy rate, it's higher in less than 35 years old, 57, and more or less the same with 36 to 37. However, 38 to 39 also, it's reasonably above 40, but if you're more than 40 years, 36% pregnancy rate. It's much better not having PGS in this age group, because the pregnancy rates are even lower if you're not doing PGS in advanced maternal age group patients. So if you see, as per the indication, recurrent miscarriages, the pregnancy rate is 31% with PGS. With recurrent implantation failure, it's significantly high, 50%, and its advanced maternal age, it's 55%, and male factor infertility, it's 54.5%, and previous poor outcome, it's even better, 50%. So that's regarding the PGS. That's been going on for a few years now. It's giving good results. And moving on to what else we can help with. Obviously, with PGS, we have to take the cells from the trophoectoderm and freeze the embryos till we get the result and do a transfer later on. And that's invasive for the embryo. It can be disturbed. There is a small risk to the embryos. And in order to overcome that problem, there is more we can do about it. That is embryonic cell-free DNA for euploidy status of the embryo. So there's been a multi-center prospective study of concordance between embryo cell-free DNA and trophoectoderm biopsies from 1301 blastocysts. So they want to see if cell-free DNA from the media of the which the blastocyst was grown was tested, and is it giving the same result as a trophoectoderm biopsy. So they do the biopsy, but they also check the embryo cell-free DNA. It's concordant in 78.2% of the patients, or even more actually. And it's a non-invasive way of analysis of embryo cell-free DNA. It's analyzed and spent in blastocyst culture media on day 5. And the high degree of concordance will help us. Sometimes we may not want to undergo invasive procedure. This non-invasive method of testing cell-free DNA is definitely going to help us in selecting a good quality embryo which has better chromosomal euploidy status. Because it's a non-invasive approach, and if we can work more on this cell-free DNA, we may be able to get close to the results of biopsy, in which case cell-free DNA testing will replace PGTA. And this is from American Journal of Obs-Gynae, and it was only published in May 2020. So far these are the advances, and I would just like to mention some results of our work here. And so far this is till October 2019, from the time we started the center in 2017, and we've done 713 embryo transfers, out of which 441 were positive, which gives a pregnancy rate of 62% and a live births of 279, and in 51 patients we were unable to contact the patients. In the ones which we note the data, it's giving us a 40% live birth rate, and if we think at least 50% of those who are unable to contact, if we take them into positive, it's giving us a 45% live birth rate which is well above the international standards, but there is a lot more we can do, because after this we've done a lot more work since October as well, and our pregnancy rate for 2019 is 66%. So it's improving year on this, and I would like to thank you all who are trusting us and sending your patients to us, because it's only possible with good teamwork. Because even pre-IVF or pre-treatment, there is a lot of work that needs to be done. We do our work here, and then once the pregnancy is confirmed, there is a lot that needs to be taken care of till they achieve a live birth. So I would like to thank all the clinicians who are supporting us to achieve this live birth rate and the pregnancy rate. And to summarize, we just need to individualize the treatment planning, and we have to judiciously use new technologies. And this individualization is extremely important, and each patient is different. So we can give hope to a lot more couples with all these advancements, and I'm hoping that when you see your patients, when someone comes across, you can give them more hope that there's a lot more that can be done for them. And thank you very much. If there's any questions I can help with? Can you hear me, Raja?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes.
Okay. Please unmute and ask if you have any questions.
Yes, ma'am. I'm checking in the chat room also. If any queries, I will let you know, ma'am.
And I would like to ask you all if you have any suggestions about any topics that you would like for future. Feel free to put it in the chat box, or please intimate our BDMs, and we'll be more than happy to guide you through that. And if there's anything that we need to know, and the most important thing I would like from all of you is, when any of you refer the patients and if they come back to you for a pregnancy, please intimate us about the outcome wherever possible, because we are missing data on a lot of live births, that is nearly 51 patients. This data will help us to improve our treatments in future. So I request this from hopefully whoever comes across, and if there is anything that you would like me to give information from my end, I'll be more than happy to.
Ma'am, as of now.
Hello.
Hello. Hello.
Dr. Swapna, this is Kavita here. Kavita.
Kavita Garu, yeah, tell me please.
Nice presentation, very informative.
Thank you.
I just wanted to ask you, when do you do ERA, like endometrial receptivity assay?
Yeah. So basically, it's with someone with recurrent implantation failure. That is, we have transferred good quality embryos for more than 2 to 3 times and 2 different IVF cycles. That is the actual indication. But however, what I have seen in my practice is, I've done for those patients, and it's definitely helpful in those patients. But in the patients who I also did are who have a beautiful endometrium and a beautiful embryo, and it did not result in a pregnancy. Because sometimes we're very confident that everything looks like textbook, but it's not happening. Then what I'm doing is offering the patients, because they may not have a lot of embryos. Say a patient had 4 embryos, 2 embryos are transferred and 2 are frozen. So when we're transferring those embryos, we need to be very careful. If we transfer and it's negative, then they have to go for a full IVF cycle again, which will cost them as much as the first cycle. In those patients, I'm offering ERA as an option, because the cost of ERA test is nearly 45,000. So in someone with good quality embryos and fantastic endometrium, if it did not result, and I offer them, and if they're having it, and many of them are getting it as pre-receptive. And then when I'm individualizing their transfer as per the report, they're getting positive results. So even in those group of patients. So in someone who had 2 or 3 transfers in 2 different IVF cycles is by textbook or as per the research that's been proven, but also in patients with good endometrium and good quality embryos, if it did not result in a pregnancy, we can offer and we can tell them what the evidence says. But if it helps, then if they can achieve the pregnancy with those 2 frozen embryos which they have, it will save them from having another IVF cycle. So I counsel them, and if they opt, we go forward and do it. But if someone has a lot of frozen embryos available, still I offer them, and it's their choice, because it's not just about whether you have embryos or not. Sometimes it's also about the trauma they go through when they have a negative result. So it's variable.
Okay, nice. Thank you. Another thing is when you do ERA, like what you said is like you need to take the sample 2 times. Is it one natural cycle and one hormone replacement therapy cycle, or is it just once?
No, we can do frozen embryo transfer in 2 ways, either in their natural cycle or in their HRT
No.
cycle.
I'm asking about ERA.
Yeah. So ERA is done only when we have frozen embryos. We can't do, we can also do in fresh, but when we stimulate in that cycle, the endometrium is totally different. We can't apply the results of ERA to a fresh embryo transfer. So the ERA can be done only when we are doing a frozen embryo transfer. And the protocol which we use for frozen embryo transfer can be a natural cycle or a HRT. Whatever we decide to use for that patient, say if they have regular cycle and we want to do a natural cycle FET, we need to do ERA in a natural cycle. That is 7 days after LH search, we need to take the biopsy. If someone has got irregular periods, then we do a HRT cycle for FET. In those group, we need to do the ERA in a HRT cycle. That is, endometrium needs to be 7 millimeter and above after giving estrogen, and then progesterone 5 days, and then taking the biopsy. Or with natural cycle, there is a higher cancellation rate. So if I'm advising ERA, I prefer to do it in a HRT cycle.
And that cycle you leave and you go for the next cycle, isn't it?
Yeah, that cycle we leave and we get the results in a couple of weeks, and then we go for the next cycle. And we use the exactly same protocol in the next cycle.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Nice presentation. Thanks for all your efforts. So
it's my pleasure. Okay, thank you everyone for joining. It's been a pleasure to be able to associate with all of you and discuss with you all, and look forward to associating with all of you in future. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much to all the doctors for spending your valuable time with Nova IVF Basic Infertility Training Program. So we will come with the feedback form, ma'am. Kindly give us a feedback. So based on your experience. Thank you.